I still remember the night the Mafia Boss first looked at me like I wasn't supposed to exist. It was just a split second, but the weight of it crushed me, like I was something wrong that should never have been seen. And in that moment, I knew something in my life was about to break. If someone told me I'd become the Mafia Boss's obsession, I would have laughed. But tonight, I realized I was never meant to escape him. I was never supposed to have witnessed what I did. The crime? It was nothing personal. It was just another one of those nights I walked home alone after finishing my late shift at the diner. The streets were empty, save for a few broken streetlights flickering above. The kind of night where nothing should be happening, but the city holds secrets, dirty ones that linger in the shadows. And I should have never walked down that street. But I did. Maybe I should have crossed the street when I saw the black car parked in the alley, the one that looked too polished, too sleek for a place like this. I should have taken a longer route, gone the other way. But I didn't. The sound of muffled voices reached me before I saw the men, and by the time I realized something was wrong, I was too close. A man stumbled out of the shadows, bleeding from his side, clutching a wad of cash in his hand. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged as if he'd been running for miles. Then the others stepped into the dim light, 3 men, and the one at the front. Well, he wasn't just any man. The way he moved, the confidence that radiated from him, made it clear that he was the one everyone feared. His cold, dead eyes scanned the area like a predator. When his gaze met mine, everything inside me froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. For a second, I thought maybe he didn't see me. But then his eyes locked onto mine, and I felt every inch of me being pulled into his darkness. His expression didn't change, but I saw the question in his eyes. Did I see too much? The briefest flicker of calculation crossed his face, and then he made a decision. That was when I knew my life was no longer my own. "You saw nothing," he said, his voice low and cutting through the still night air like a blade. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a threat. It was an order. And as if to drive the point home, he took a step closer, the silence between us thickening. I had no choice but to nod, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. He could have killed me. He should have. But instead, he dragged me into something far worse. "You don't belong here," he added, his eyes boring into mine like he was looking for something I didn't know how to hide. His gaze was like ice, but it felt like fire all the same. And I don't like loose ends. Before I could react, one of his men grabbed my arm. His grip was hard, unforgiving. The other 2 stood silently, watching, waiting for something. Maybe for me to run, maybe for me to beg. But I didn't do either. "Take her," the boss ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. "Let's see if she learns to keep her mouth shut." I barely had time to process what was happening before the men began dragging me toward the black car. I fought, but it was useless. The one holding my arm tightened his grip, and the others flanked me on either side, their presence suffocating. As we reached the car, the boss followed, moving with a calm, predatory grace. I tried to look away, tried to keep my focus on anything but him, but my eyes betrayed me. His cold, calculating gaze was all I could see. The car door slammed shut behind me, and the engine roared to life. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. He didn't answer right away, but the corners of his lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his tone chilling. "But for now, stay quiet." And I did. The ride felt like hours, but in reality it was probably only minutes. The city lights blurred past, and all I could think about was what I had seen, and what they had seen in me. When the car finally came to a stop, I was pulled out without a word and escorted into what seemed like an abandoned building. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what to expect. But as the door to the inner room opened, I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. Something I would never forget. A man was on his knees, blood pooling beneath him. Another man stood over him, a gun in hand. The silence in the room was suffocating, but the tension in the air was worse. This was no random crime. This was something calculated, something dark. The boss stepped in behind me, and I felt the heat of his presence, as if he was suffocating me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized just how deep into the darkness I had fallen. "Take a seat," he said, his voice smooth, like he was giving a simple command. But it wasn't simple. Not anymore. I didn't move, my body frozen in place. I was too afraid to move. The man kneeling in front of us started to cry, his sobs echoing in the empty room. But the Mafia boss didn't flinch. He just stood there, his cold eyes watching the man, his face a mask of indifference. "Please, don't," the man begged, his voice raw with fear. "I didn't mean it. I swear, I didn't—" "Shut up," the boss interrupted, his voice as cold as death. The man fell silent, trembling, as if he knew what was coming next. And I knew too. The air in the room was thick with the smell of fear and blood. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was trapped in this nightmare, and I had no idea how to get out. But it was too late to run. The air felt heavier with each passing second, thick with tension and fear. I stood there, unable to move, as the Mafia boss stood beside me, his presence like a suffocating shadow. The man on his knees begging was the only sound in the room, his desperate pleas breaking the silence. But nothing changed. The boss didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on me, sharp and unblinking. I could feel the weight of it, pressing against my chest. I wanted to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen the horrors unfolding in front of me, but I couldn't. His eyes were everywhere, even when they weren't directly on me. "You saw it all, didn't you?" he finally asked, his voice so calm, so detached, it sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard. My mind raced, but my body remained frozen. I didn't mean to," I stammered, barely able to form the words. "I didn't want to see anything. I was just walking. It doesn't matter," he interrupted, his voice low and cutting. "You saw what you shouldn't have, and now you're part of it." The man on his knees whimpered, his sobs echoing in the room like the final tortured breaths of a dying animal. But it wasn't enough to make the boss flinch. The man's pleas fell on deaf ears. "Please," the man begged again, his voice cracking. "I swear, I'll do anything." The boss raised a hand, cutting him off. It was a small gesture, but it carried so much weight, like a king ordering the execution of a traitor. The sound of the gunshot that followed was deafening. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. The man's body jerked, the blood splattering across the cold concrete floor, and just like that, everything went still. The man was dead. I didn't know how long we stood there. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stop, and all I could do was stand frozen in place. The air tasted like copper, thick and heavy with blood. Finally, the boss spoke again, his tone as indifferent as ever. "You'll learn to keep your mouth shut," he said, his eyes finally leaving me to glance over at the dead man's body. "Because if you don't, the next one might be you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. "Take her upstairs," the boss ordered, his eyes flicking to one of his men standing near the door. "Get her settled." The man nodded and grabbed my arm, pulling me out of the room. I barely registered the movement, still in shock from what I'd just witnessed. I was led up a narrow staircase and into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare, the floor cold beneath my feet. A single bed, a wooden chair, and a small table were the only furniture in the room. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The man shoved me inside and slammed the door shut behind me, the sound echoing through the silence. I stood there for a moment, my breath ragged, my body shaking. What had just happened? What was I going to do now? I ran my hands through my hair, trying to collect myself. I couldn't think. I couldn't process. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to survive this. Not if I didn't get out. I paced the room, my mind racing, but I couldn't find an answer. Every time I tried to think of a way out, his cold, calculating eyes would flash in my mind. The way he looked at me, like I was a problem he hadn't figured out yet. And the way he moved, like he knew exactly what to do to break you without lifting a finger. I couldn't escape him. Not now. Not after everything I'd seen. But there was one thing I could do. Survive. And that thought brought a sick sense of clarity. I sat on the bed, my hands trembling as I tried to calm my breathing. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was bigger than I could even comprehend. I wasn't just in danger of dying. I was in danger of losing myself, of becoming something I didn't recognize. There was no turning back. Not after what I had witnessed. I jumped when the door creaked open. My heart skipped a beat, but it was only one of the men from earlier. He didn't say anything. Just stepped inside and locked the door behind him, his eyes scanning the room like he was making sure I wasn't going to try anything stupid. He moved toward the bed, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket. I instinctively shrank back, but he didn't seem to notice. "Boss's orders," he said gruffly, tossing something onto the bed. "Clothes. You'll need them." I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't know what to say. The man glanced at me before heading for the door. "You'll be okay," he muttered, his voice almost too soft for a man like him. "Just stay quiet. Stay quiet." The words echoed in my mind as he left, the door clicking shut behind him. I stared at the clothes he left behind. A simple black dress, shoes, and a jacket. It wasn't much, but it felt like a prison uniform, a reminder of how far I had fallen. I wasn't going to stay quiet. I wasn't going to just sit back and wait for my life to be ripped apart by the man who had just killed someone in front of me like it was nothing. I was going to survive. I had to. I didn't know how, but I was going to find a way out. But first, I had to make sure he didn't see me coming. I couldn't sit still for long. Every minute in that room felt like an eternity, the silence pressing against me, suffocating me. The clothes the man left behind sat there, mocking me, reminding me of the life I no longer had. I stared at them for a long time, wondering if putting them on would make me feel like I belonged here, like I was being swallowed by this dark world I didn't choose. But I couldn't afford to give in. Not yet. I pushed the dress aside and paced the room, my hands shaking. I wasn't a fighter, wasn't a tough girl, wasn't the type to be tangled up in something like this. But what I had seen, what I had been dragged into, was no longer a choice. I needed to understand the rules of this world if I was going to survive. And the first rule was clear: keep quiet. I gritted my teeth, pushing the thoughts of escape to the back of my mind. For now, I had to learn, had to observe, had to wait for the right moment. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how stupid that sounded. There was no right moment. In a place like this, there was only one moment. The one where you either survived or you didn't. I snapped my eyes to the door, wondering if I should try to make a run for it. But I knew better than that. I knew what would happen to someone who tried to run. I shuddered, wrapping my arms around myself. A soft knock at the door made me freeze. I didn't know who it was, couldn't tell, but I wasn't about to open it. Not without knowing what was on the other side. "Who's there?" My voice came out hoarse, shaking from the tension. The door creaked open a little, just enough for the man to peek his head inside. His face was familiar, the one who'd dragged me into the room earlier. The one who had been so cold, so indifferent, like I was nothing but another piece of the puzzle. "Boss wants to see you," he said, his voice flat, unemotional. My heart pounded in my chest. The boss. I hadn't seen him since that night in the alley, but the image of his eyes, the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd made me feel like I wasn't meant to exist, was still fresh in my mind. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. I could stay in this room, keep my head down, and hope that nothing else happened. Or I could face him. I didn't think there was a choice. Not really. I nodded and followed the man down the narrow hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. Every step I took felt like it was leading me deeper into the abyss. The building was quiet, the only sound the soft shuffle of our footsteps on the concrete floor. The farther we went, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. When we reached the door, the man didn't knock. He just opened it, revealing a dimly lit office inside. The boss was sitting behind a desk, his hands steepled in front of him. His eyes were on me the moment I stepped inside. "Close the door," he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. I did as I was told, locking the door behind me. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. "Sit," he ordered, motioning to the chair in front of him. I sat, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart still racing. I tried to focus on my breathing, but it was hard with his gaze drilling into me. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. He was waiting for me to speak, to say something, but I had nothing to offer. I wasn't stupid enough to think I could make this better by talking. Finally, he broke the silence. "You saw too much," he said, his voice as cold as it had been that night. "And now you're here." I didn't know what to say to that. "I didn't want to see anything," I said quietly. It was the truth. I hadn't asked for any of this. "You don't get to choose," he replied, his voice soft but deadly. "The world doesn't work that way. You saw what you shouldn't have, and now you're part of it, whether you like it or not." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Do you know what I do, girl?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. I shook my head, afraid to speak, afraid of what would come out of my mouth. "Let me explain," he said, his voice silky smooth, like a predator enjoying its prey's fear. "I make sure things run smoothly. I eliminate the problems, the people who get in the way. You've seen what I'm capable of, haven't you?" I nodded stiffly, unable to look away. "Good," he said, leaning forward. "Now you're going to learn to do the same. Or you'll become a problem, too." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had no choice. I was trapped. I was in his world now, whether I wanted to be or not. "I'm not like you," I said, my voice shaking despite myself. He smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You will be, if you want to survive." He stood then, walking around the desk to stand in front of me. I instinctively pulled back, but he didn't stop. "I'm not going to hurt you. Not yet," he said, his voice low and almost soothing. "But if you cross me, if you try to run, I will. And it won't be quick. Understand?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The air between us was suffocating, and I couldn't breathe. He was dangerous, deadly, a man who could end me with a flick of his wrist. But worse than that was the way he looked at me, like he wasn't just threatening me. He was studying me. He was trying to figure me out. I wasn't sure if I was meant to be afraid of him or to obey him. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let me go. Not until I was part of his world, too. I sat in that chair for what felt like an eternity, watching him as he stood there, every inch of him exuding an intimidating, quiet power. The silence stretched between us like a heavy, unspoken promise, one that neither of us was willing to acknowledge out loud, but one that was clear nonetheless. "I don't like loose ends," he said finally, his voice breaking the stillness like a knife slicing through flesh. "And right now, you're a loose end." I could feel the weight of his words, how they settled in my chest like a cold stone. His gaze was relentless, piercing through me, making me feel like I was nothing more than a subject under his scrutiny. It made me want to squirm in my seat, but I fought it. The last thing I wanted was to show weakness. "Your options," he continued, taking a step toward me, his shadow swallowing mine, "are simple. You learn how to keep your mouth shut, and you stay out of my way. Or you don't. And if you don't, well, you already saw what happens." I couldn't bring myself to respond. My mouth was dry, my heart beat loud in my ears. I had no idea how to navigate this. I didn't belong here. I wasn't meant to be caught up in his world, in his darkness. But I was, and there was no way out. Not yet. His gaze softened just for a moment, but it wasn't comforting. It was more like a promise, a warning, wrapped in an almost chilling sense of patience. "I'll give you time," he said almost casually, "but not much. You're a smart girl, I can tell. So figure out what you want to be in this world." He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the window, the faint light from the street below casting shadows across his figure. He didn't look back, but I knew he was still watching me in the reflection. His presence was everywhere, impossible to escape. The man who had escorted me here stepped forward, breaking the tension in the room. "Boss wants you to stay in the building for now. He says you'll learn your place soon enough." I nodded stiffly, still too paralyzed to speak. The man didn't seem to care whether I responded or not. "Follow me," he said flatly, turning on his heel. I stood, legs unsteady as I followed him down the hallway. My mind was spinning. The truth of what was happening, what I had gotten myself into, was beginning to settle in, suffocating me, one breath at a time. But there was something else, too. A strange, twisted curiosity. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know why he was doing this to me. I wasn't stupid. I could see the power he held, the control he wielded without ever needing to raise his voice or lift a finger. He was terrifying, yes, but he was also captivating in a way I couldn't fully explain. We reached a small, dimly lit room with a single cot. It looked like a holding cell, nothing more. The man opened the door and motioned for me to step inside. "This will be your room for now," he said, his tone still cold. "Don't leave. Don't try anything stupid." I stepped inside, feeling the door close behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. There was no turning back now. The man left without another word, and I was alone again. The silence seemed louder this time, oppressive in a way that I couldn't escape. I sat on the cot, my head spinning. I had no idea what the boss wanted from me, why I was still alive, why he hadn't just killed me. Was it because I was useful to him somehow? Or was it because he wanted to break me, turn me into someone who would never escape his grasp? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I knew about him, or his world. I had been thrown into a game I didn't understand, with rules I didn't know how to follow. But one thing was clear. I had to adapt if I was going to survive. Hours passed and I tried to rest, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood, the body in the alley, the coldness in the boss's eyes. It wasn't just the crime I'd witnessed, it was the weight of his gaze, the feeling that he was always watching, always waiting. The door to my room opened without warning, the loud creak breaking through the quiet. I jumped, my heart leaping in my chest. A different man entered this time, one I hadn't seen before. His face was rough, his clothes more casual than the others. He didn't look as intimidating as the others, but there was something about him that made me wary. "Boss says you're to join him for dinner," he said, his voice gruff. "Come on." I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I had no choice but to follow, so I stood and made my way out of the room. The man led me down the hallway again, this time toward a large, lavishly furnished room. When we entered, I was struck by the stark contrast to everything else in the building. The room was warm, cozy even, the light from the chandelier casting a soft glow across the polished wood floors. There were 2 large chairs at a long table, and at the far end of the room, the boss was sitting, his back to me. "Sit," he commanded, not looking up from his glass of wine. "I won't bite." I didn't hesitate this time. I sat in the chair opposite him, careful to keep my posture straight. I wasn't sure what this dinner was supposed to mean, but I knew it wasn't just a casual meal. Not with him. Not after everything that had happened. The silence between us stretched on for a moment, and I could feel the tension creeping up my spine. "Have you had time to think?" he asked, his voice low. His eyes lifted to meet mine, the intensity of his gaze making my skin crawl. "I don't know what you want from me," I said quietly, the words barely escaping my throat. It wasn't a challenge, but more of a confession. I needed to understand. The boss took a slow sip of his wine before speaking again. "I want you to understand the game you're in. You don't get to walk away from this. Not unless I say so. I didn't speak. I didn't know what to say. He continued. You saw something you shouldn't have, and now you're mine. For better or worse, you're part of this now. You'll learn your place, or I'll show you what happens when people don't learn. I swallowed, the weight of his words settling in my chest. What if I refuse? The words slipped out before I could stop them. His eyes flashed with something. Amusement, maybe, or irritation. I couldn't tell. Then you'll make things difficult for yourself, he said, his voice growing colder. I don't want to make things difficult for you, but if you push me, I'll show you what happens when someone refuses to understand their role. I wasn't sure if he was threatening me or just stating a fact, but either way it didn't matter. I was in this now, and I had no idea how to get out. I didn't speak again after that. The silence between us was almost suffocating, thick with unspoken promises and hidden threats. The only sound in the room was the soft clink of his glass as he took another sip of wine. I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could sit here, pretending like I wasn't drowning in this dark, twisted world he'd pulled me into. Eat, he said, breaking the silence, his voice so casual, like we were simply two strangers having a meal. I hadn't realized until then how hungry I was. My body hadn't felt the pangs of hunger until the moment he told me to eat. I looked at the plate in front of me, simple, but it was enough. I picked up my fork, unsure of what he expected, unsure of what would happen next. But I didn't want to make any mistakes, not now. I pushed the food around on my plate for a while, picking at it but not really eating. His gaze never left me. It was like he was waiting for me to do something. Something wrong. Something to justify whatever his next move would be. You haven't answered my question, he said after a long silence, his voice low and calm. Have you thought about what you want to be in this world? His words sent a chill through me. I knew exactly what he meant. I just want to survive, I finally said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He tilted his head, as if considering my response. That's not enough, he said softly. Surviving isn't enough in my world. I looked down at my plate, my fork now forgotten in my hand. Then what is enough? I asked, not daring to meet his eyes. His lips curled into a small, cold smile. You're not just surviving anymore. You're part of something bigger. You're part of me. And whether you like it or not, you'll learn to be useful. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. The words were chilling, cold, and final. I was trapped, caught in his web of control, unable to break free. How do I learn to be useful? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. I didn't want to know the answer, but at the same time, I needed to. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. There was something predatory about the way he looked at me, like he was savoring every moment, every word. You'll learn by watching, he said, his tone almost lazy. By understanding how the game works. By seeing who's weak and who's strong. You'll learn what happens when you get in my way, and what happens when you don't. I shivered involuntarily, my grip tightening on the edge of the table. What happens if I don't want to play this game? His smile widened, but there was no humor in it. That's not an option. You're already in it, whether you want to be or not. If you think you can walk away, you're mistaken. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. This wasn't just a world of crime. It was a world of power, and I had none. The moment I had seen too much, I had become a part of it. There was no going back. There was no way out. "Then what do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flickered with something dark. "For now, I just want you to understand your place. You'll be close. Close enough to learn, close enough to make mistakes. But you'll stay out of my way. And if you do that, you'll survive." My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if I could do that. I wasn't sure if I could live under his thumb, always watching, always waiting for the next command, the next move. He stood then, the movement sudden and fluid. "I'm done with the small talk," he said, his voice cool, detached. "I've made myself clear. Now you'll follow me." I stood quickly, my legs shaking beneath me. But I didn't argue. I didn't question. I followed him through the large, quiet house, each step I took seeming to echo through the cold halls. He didn't speak as we moved through the dimly lit corridors, but I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, like a constant presence hovering just behind me. We stopped in front of a large, reinforced door. He turned to me, his face unreadable. "This is where you'll stay," he said, his voice hard, but not unkind. "You'll sleep here, eat here, and work here. And if you do your job well, you'll be treated well." The door creaked open and I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the space. It was a small, sterile room, with just a bed, a desk, and a window that was too high to see out of. It felt like a cage, but one that I couldn't escape. "What job?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped into the room behind me and closed the door, locking it with a quiet click. "You'll learn," he said simply, his voice distant now, like he was already thinking ahead. "You'll see what happens next." And then, just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the room, with only the soft hum of the lights above me to keep me company. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space in front of me. I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know how to survive in this new world, this world where he was always watching, always waiting. But one thing was certain. I had no choice. I was trapped, and if I wanted to live, I would have to play by his rules. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. I couldn't remember how many times I had paced the small room, or how many times I had stared out that tiny window, hoping for something, anything, to break the suffocating silence. But there was nothing. The hours crawled by, and the only thing that kept me company was the ever-present feeling of the boss's eyes on me, even when he wasn't physically near. I had learned quickly that there was no room for mistakes here, no room for weakness. Each day I was expected to follow his unspoken rules, moving in silence, never questioning his authority. I ate the meals left for me, never complaining, never speaking out of turn. I knew that the moment I did, I would be nothing more than a problem. And I had seen what happened to problems. One morning, after what felt like an eternity, the door to my room opened. I didn't look up right away. I didn't need to. I knew who it was. The man who had escorted me to the boss's office days ago stepped inside, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Boss wants you," he said, his voice flat. "Get ready." I nodded, my stomach twisting. What did he want now? What new task had he decided I was ready for? The thought of whatever he had planned made my skin crawl, but there was nothing I could do. Not if I wanted to survive. I stood up and followed him, my legs unsteady but determined. We walked down the long hallway in silence, the air heavy with tension. The closer we got to the boss's office, the more I felt like I was heading to my own execution. When we reached the door, the man knocked twice before entering, and I stepped inside. The boss was sitting behind his desk, the same cold, calculating look on his face. He didn't acknowledge me at first, his eyes scanning something on his desk, but I could feel his presence filling the room. "Close the door," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. I did as instructed, the sound of the door closing behind me making my heart race. "Sit," he commanded, motioning to the chair across from him. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down, my hands folded tightly in my lap. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might not speak. But then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "You've been here long enough," he said, his tone steady, but with an underlying sense of finality. "It's time for you to learn your role in all of this." I swallowed hard, unsure of what he meant. My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to speak. "What role?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a file. He opened it, his eyes scanning the papers inside before glancing back at me. "You've seen things you shouldn't have," he said slowly. "And now you're going to help me make sure no one else does. That's your role. You'll learn to clean up messes, to make sure no one talks. You'll be part of my operation." I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just about being a silent witness anymore. This was something darker, something far more dangerous. "You'll be given tasks," he continued, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "You'll learn how to handle things that go wrong. You'll be the one to clean up the aftermath. If something gets messy, you'll fix it." I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him I didn't want this, but I knew better. It wasn't an option. Not anymore. "What if I refuse?" I found myself asking before I could stop myself. His expression didn't change. He simply leaned forward, his eyes dark and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "You don't refuse," he said softly, but the threat in his voice was unmistakable. "You do as you're told. Because if you don't, the consequences will be more than you can handle." I didn't speak again. What could I say? The truth was clear. I was trapped. There was no way out. The moment I'd seen that crime, I'd sealed my fate. Now I was just a tool to him, another pawn in his twisted world. "I'll give you some time to think," he said, breaking the silence. "But understand this. Refusing isn't an option. You're already part of this. You're not going anywhere." I nodded slowly, my hands trembling in my lap. I wasn't sure if he was trying to scare me or simply stating the facts. Either way, it didn't matter. He was right. I was in this world now, and there was no way out. The boss stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he walked to the window. He stared out at the city below, his back to me. "You have a choice," he said, his voice distant, almost like he was speaking to himself. "You can either accept your place here and learn to be useful, or you can make things difficult for yourself. But either way, you'll stay. You'll be part of this, whether you like it or not." I didn't respond. What was there to say? After a few moments of silence, he turned to face me again. His eyes were colder than ever. "I'll be sending someone to show you the ropes," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll learn what's expected of you, and if you don't, well, you know the consequences." I didn't respond. What could I say? The door to the office opened, and one of the men entered, standing by the door like a silent sentinel. "You're dismissed," the boss said, his voice sharp. "Get to work." I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, but I didn't hesitate. I had no choice but to follow. The man led me out of the office and down the hallway, his presence like a shadow trailing behind me. We stopped in front of another door, one I hadn't seen before. It was just as heavy and imposing as the others, but there was something about it that made my stomach twist. The man opened the door, gesturing for me to step inside. "This is where you'll begin," he said, his voice low. "Everything you need to learn starts here." I stepped inside and the door closed behind me. The room was small, almost claustrophobic. There was a desk, a chair, and a large filing cabinet in the corner. The walls were bare, save for a few dim lights overhead. But it wasn't the room itself that made my blood run cold. It was what I saw on the desk. A set of files. Names, dates, pictures. All of them connected to people who were no longer a part of the world outside this building. The man walked over to the desk, his fingers brushing over the files. "These are the people you'll be dealing with," he said. "This is where your real work begins. You'll learn how to make people disappear. Permanently." I swallowed hard. This was it. This was the job the boss had meant for me. And I didn't know if I was ready. But I didn't have a choice. The man placed one of the files in front of me, his fingers tapping the top with an eerie sense of finality. "These people," he said, his voice low, "are the ones who have crossed the boss. They've caused problems, and now it's your job to deal with them." I stared down at the file in front of me, the words on the cover blurred by the shaking of my hands. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to look inside, but I had no choice. "You'll learn how to clean up messes," the man continued, his eyes never leaving me. "You'll be the one to make sure no one gets in the way. No one knows what happens to them. And most importantly, no one talks." I slowly opened the file, my stomach twisting with dread. The picture inside was grainy, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the face. The person in the photo was someone who, once upon a time, might have walked past me on the street. A normal face in a normal crowd. Now they were a target. A pawn. I felt the weight of the task sink in, like a lead ball in the pit of my stomach. I had been thrown into something so much darker than I had ever imagined. The boss didn't just want silence from me. He wanted me to become an executioner. The file detailed everything. The person's name, their history, what they had done to cross the boss, and where they could be found. It was clinical. No emotion. Just a name, a photo, a death sentence. "You'll learn how to handle these things," the man said again. "You'll follow the orders, and you'll make sure they don't come back to haunt us." I wanted to scream, to throw the file back at him and tell him I wasn't capable of this. But I knew better. I had seen too much. I was already too deep in it. There was no going back now. The man stepped away from the desk, leaving me alone with the file. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. The task before me was impossible. I wasn't a killer. I wasn't like him. But the longer I stayed in this world, the more I realized I had no choice. I was part of it now. "Take your time," the man said as he left the room, closing the door behind him. "But not too much." The boss doesn't like waiting. As the door clicked shut, I was left alone in the silence, staring at the file in front of me. My chest felt tight, suffocated by the weight of what I was being asked to do. But I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what would happen if I didn't comply. I ran my fingers over the picture, trying to steady myself. This person, they were a target. A casualty in a world where the boss held all the power. I didn't have to know the details. I didn't have to understand. All I had to do was follow orders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That the deeper I went, the harder it would be to stay human. I closed the file, but the image of that face wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The sound of footsteps outside the door broke me from my thoughts. I didn't look up when the door opened, but I heard the familiar voice. "Boss wants to see you." The word sent a chill down my spine. What now? What else could he possibly want from me? I stood up slowly, my legs still shaky from the weight of what I'd just seen. The man stood by the door, waiting for me to follow, and without a word, I did. The hallway seemed longer this time. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on me. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know what the boss wanted now. But I had learned one thing in the short time I had been here. When he called, you came. We reached his office and the man opened the door without knocking. I stepped inside, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. There was no coldness in the air. Instead, there was a sense of anticipation. The boss was standing by the window, looking out at the city below, his back to me. "You've seen what happens when things go wrong," he said, his voice smooth, almost casual. "Now I want to see what you'll do when they go right." I didn't understand what he meant. The question hung in the air like a riddle I couldn't solve. But I didn't ask. I wasn't here to ask questions. The boss turned to face me then, his gaze locking onto mine. There was something different about the way he looked at me today. Something almost thoughtful. "You've been here long enough to know that nothing is ever as it seems," he said, his voice soft but intense. "This world isn't black and white. There are no heroes, just people who are willing to do what it takes to survive." I said nothing, just waited for him to continue. "I've given you a chance," he continued, stepping closer. "And I expect results. I don't take kindly to failures, but I think you're smart enough not to disappoint me." I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. His approval didn't feel like something to be proud of. But I wasn't going to show fear. Not now. Not after everything. "Do you understand?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "Good," he said with a nod, his lips curling into that cold, calculating smile I had come to recognize all too well. "Then let's see how well you perform." He turned away, walking back to his desk. I didn't know what he meant, but the file I had seen earlier flashed in my mind again. The task, the blood, the people who would never see another day. The boss sat down behind his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood. "I've set up a test for you," he said almost lazily. "A real test." My stomach dropped. "A test? What kind of test?" "You'll be sent to deal with one of our problems," he continued, his voice low, almost detached. "You'll go out there and you'll take care of it. If you succeed, you'll prove you belong here. If not, well, I'm sure you'll figure it out." I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words crashed down on me like 1,000 tons of stone. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. I was going to have to kill. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my mind unable to focus on anything other than the weight of the boss's words. A test. A real test. I had been given tasks before. Simple things, cleaning up after the messes others had made. But this felt different. This was a test of everything I had learned, everything I had become since I stepped foot into this dark world. The hours passed in a blur as I sat alone in my room, replaying his words over and over again in my head. What would he expect from me? What kind of problem was I supposed to deal with? I thought back to the file, the faces of people who had crossed the boss. He hadn't been specific, but I could imagine what was expected of me. A problem meant someone who couldn't be controlled, someone who had become too much of a threat. And I knew that in this world, threats were dealt with swiftly. The door to my room opened again, breaking my thoughts. The same man who had escorted me to the boss's office days before stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Get up," he said, his voice flat. "Time to go. The boss has a job for you." I stood without a word, my legs feeling stiff from sitting for too long. My body was still adjusting to the cold, suffocating atmosphere of this place. But there was no time to think about it. There was only one thing that mattered now: survival. I followed the man down the hallway, my steps echoing in the stillness of the house. We passed the same dark corridors, the same lifeless rooms. Every part of this place felt like a prison, and I was just another prisoner. We stopped in front of a door I hadn't seen before, one that looked far more secure than the others. The man opened it, revealing a small, dimly lit room with a single chair in the center. "Sit," he ordered, gesturing to the chair. I hesitated for a moment, but then obeyed. The door clicked shut behind me, and I was left alone in the room. My heart began to race again, the tension thick in the air. I didn't know what was coming, but I could feel it. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong move would send me plunging into the darkness below. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and a different man entered. This one was taller, his face hard and scarred, his eyes cold as ice. He looked like a man who had seen too much. He had the same sense of danger as the boss, but it was rawer, more immediate. "Get up," he said, his voice like gravel. "You're coming with me." I stood slowly, trying to hide the nervousness that had crept into my chest. He motioned for me to follow, and we walked out of the room without another word. We moved through the hallways quickly, the sound of our footsteps the only noise in the oppressive silence. My mind was spinning. Was this the moment? The moment when I had to prove myself? We stopped in front of another door, and the man knocked once before entering. Inside was a darkened room, only lit by the glow of a single desk lamp. The boss was sitting behind a desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface. "Sit," he said without looking up. "We've got business." I obeyed, taking the seat across from him. His eyes finally lifted, meeting mine with that same cold intensity I had come to know so well. "This," he said, sliding a file across the desk toward me, "is your first real assignment." I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the edges of the file. It was thick, filled with pages I couldn't bring myself to look at yet. "Your job is simple," the boss continued, his voice low and calm. "You take care of this problem. You deal with them. End it." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a cleanup job. This wasn't just about covering up someone's mistake. This was real. This was the test. I opened the file, my breath catching in my throat as I looked at the first page. A name, a picture, an address. The person in the photo was someone I had seen before. Someone I had once brushed past on the street. A normal person. Now they were a target. "Are you ready for this?" the boss asked, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Because once you take this step, there's no going back." I nodded slowly, my hands shaking as I closed the file. "I'm ready," I said, more to convince myself than him. The boss didn't respond. He simply slid the file toward me, his gaze never leaving mine. "Then go. Do what needs to be done." The cold night air hit me as soon as I stepped out of the building, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on me like a 100-pound anchor. The man who had led me here, a different one from before, was already waiting for me outside. He didn't say anything as I climbed into the back of the sleek black car, but I could feel his eyes on me, measuring, studying. The streets blurred past as the car drove through the city, the lights reflecting off the window, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope of motion. But all I could focus on was the file, clutched tightly in my hands. The address, the person, the target. I couldn't stop thinking about the face in the photo. The person I was about to kill. The boss hadn't given me details, hadn't told me why this person had to go, but that didn't matter. In this world, it wasn't about why. It was about obeying the orders, staying in line, and I had no choice but to obey. The car finally stopped, the tires crunching against gravel as it pulled into a dark alley. My heart was pounding, and my palms were slick with sweat. I was in too deep. I had been from the moment I'd seen that crime, from the moment the boss had looked at me like I was something to be controlled. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The man behind me followed, moving with a silent, predatory grace. We didn't speak as we approached the door. The address on the file matched what I saw in front of me. It was a nondescript building tucked away in an alley, far from the glimmering lights of the city's center. It looked like nothing special, just another forgotten corner of the city. But there was nothing ordinary about it now. This was where the world I had entered collided with reality. The man knocked once, sharply. The door opened, and we were led inside without a word. The room we entered was small, with only a single light hanging overhead. It cast long shadows across the floor, illuminating the figure sitting in the corner. The target. They looked up as we entered, their eyes wide, their breath shaky. They had no idea what was coming. I could feel the man beside me move, his presence a quiet pressure on my back. But I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the person in front of me, trying to keep my composure. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know how much. The desperation in their eyes was palpable, their chest rising and falling in short, panicked breaths. I could almost hear the thoughts racing through their mind. Why? What had they done? Who were we? It didn't matter. "You know why we're here," the man said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "You've made a mistake, and the boss doesn't forgive mistakes." The person's eyes flicked to me, and I saw the recognition flash across their face. They knew I was the one who had come to end it. "You don't have to do this," they pleaded, their voice cracking. "Please, I can make it right. I'll fix it. I'll give you whatever you want." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The silence between us was thick with tension, and I could feel the pressure building in the air, like the calm before a storm. The man stepped forward, grabbing the target's arm with one swift motion. "It's too late for that." I flinched at the sound of his grip tightening, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to. This was part of the game I had been thrown into. I felt the weight of the gun in my hand before I even realized I had grabbed it. The cold metal was familiar, almost comforting. But it wasn't the gun that was making my heart race. It was the fact that I was holding it to someone's life. The person looked at me, their eyes pleading. They knew. They knew what was coming. "Please," they whispered again, their voice breaking. "Don't do this." I didn't give them the chance to finish. The moment I saw the hesitation in their eyes, I knew. I knew I had to do it. I had to end it. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a sharp crack that seemed to echo in the small room. Their body jerked back, collapsing to the floor, the blood staining the ground beneath them. For a moment, everything was silent. The world seemed to freeze, like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, the gun still gripped tightly in my hands. I had done it. I had taken someone's life. But I couldn't think about that right now. Not yet. The job was done, and now I had to move on. I had to forget. I stepped back, my legs shaking, the weight of what I had just done settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The man beside me didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He didn't care. We left the room without another word, the door shutting behind us with a quiet click. I didn't feel anything. Not yet. The drive back to the compound was long and silent, the tension thick in the air. The weight of the gun, now cold and empty in my hand, felt like a reminder of what I had just done. But I couldn't let myself think about it. Not yet. When we arrived, the man led me back inside, his footsteps echoing in the hallway as we made our way back to the office. The boss was waiting for me, sitting behind his desk, the same cold expression on his face as always. He didn't look up when I entered, but I could feel his eyes on me. "You did well," he said finally, his voice smooth and measured. "You handled the job. You followed through." I didn't say anything. I didn't know how to respond. "That's the first step," he continued, his gaze never leaving me. "The first step toward becoming a part of this world." I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't part of this world. I was just a tool, a pawn. But as I stood there, I realized something. There was no escape from this. There never had been. The next few days felt like I was walking through a fog. The events of the night replayed in my mind over and over again, but I couldn't seem to process them. The boss was right. I had followed through. I had done the job. But it didn't feel like an accomplishment. It felt like I had stepped deeper into something I couldn't escape, something I would never be able to erase from my soul. I stayed in my room for the most part, trying to stay out of the way, trying to hide from the reality of what I had just become a part of. The silence of the place was maddening, but it was better than facing the truth. I couldn't bring myself to talk to anyone, to look anyone in the eye. I had crossed a line, and I knew there was no coming back from it. But the worst part? The worst part was how numb I felt. The first time I had heard the gunshot, the sound had nearly paralyzed me. But now the cold metal in my hand didn't seem so foreign. It didn't make my heart race. It didn't send me spiraling into a panic. It felt necessary. And that scared me more than anything else. I had already started to feel the coldness creeping in, the emptiness, the realization that in this world there was no place for hesitation, no place for morality. There was only power. And the moment I had pulled that trigger, I had taken my first step into that world. The door to my room creaked open one afternoon, and I didn't even need to look up to know who it was. The same man who had escorted me before stood in the doorway, his face impassive, like he was delivering another simple order. "Boss wants to see you," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I nodded slowly, my stomach churning at the thought of facing him again. I didn't know what he wanted now. What more could there be? I had done what he asked. I had proven I could kill. But as I followed the man down the hallway, I realized that I would never be the same. Not after what I had done. We reached the door to the boss's office, and the man opened it, motioning for me to step inside. I did hesitantly, my mind still racing. The boss was sitting behind his desk, his eyes never leaving me as I entered. There was something different in the way he looked at me this time, something almost calculating. "Sit," he said, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I sat down across from him, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. I was still shaking, and I knew he could see it, but I didn't care. "You did well," he said, his tone almost approving. "You followed through, but you're not finished yet." My heart skipped a beat at his words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The boss didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze sharp and piercing. "That was just the beginning," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Now you'll learn what it really means to be part of this world. You'll learn how to take control, how to handle the people who get in your way." I didn't speak. What could I say? I had no choice but to obey. "Tomorrow," he continued, "you'll be assigned to a new task. It's time for you to step up. No more hiding." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "What do you mean by step up?" The boss smiled, but it wasn't kind. It wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was a smile that made my blood run cold. "You'll see," he said cryptically. "Tomorrow you'll learn your true place. You'll be given a new assignment. Something bigger, something more important." My mind raced with questions, but I kept them to myself. I didn't dare speak again. The boss leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk in a slow, rhythmic pattern. He was watching me, studying me, like he was waiting for something. But I had no idea what. "You've proven you can follow orders," he said finally. "But now you'll prove you can make decisions. You'll prove that you can think like I do." I nodded, though inside I was terrified. I didn't know if I was ready for this. I didn't know if I would ever be ready. But I couldn't back out now. The boss stood up, and I followed suit, my legs shaky beneath me. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet but full of that same cold authority. "You'll be ready. Don't disappoint me." I stood there, rooted to the spot, as he walked past me and out the door without another word. The room felt suddenly empty, devoid of any warmth or life. The weight of what I had just been told was heavy, suffocating. I was no longer just following orders. I was being groomed for something far worse, and I had no idea how to stop it. I spent the rest of the evening locked in my room, pacing, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The boss's words echoed in my mind like a haunting refrain. Tomorrow, everything would change. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The fear gnawed at me, the uncertainty eating away at my resolve. What would the new task be? What would he expect from me this time? By the time morning came, I was a wreck, barely able to focus on anything other than the dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. The man returned to my room, the same one who had escorted me before. He didn't say anything at first, just motioned for me to follow. I did, without a word. We walked through the corridors again, but this time it felt different. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive. I could feel my anxiety rising with each step. We stopped in front of another door, one I hadn't seen before. The man knocked once, and a voice from inside answered, cold and distant. "Come in." The door swung open, and I stepped inside. The room was large, with a long table at the center. There were several men seated around it, all of them looking up as I entered. The boss was standing at the far end of the table, his eyes fixed on me. "Sit," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. I obeyed, my heart pounding in my chest. "These men are part of the operation," the boss said, his tone cold, calculating. "And today, you'll prove you're ready to be part of it too." I sat down at the table, my mind racing as I scanned the faces around me. There were 5 men in total, all of them older, their expressions hard, their eyes guarded. None of them spoke, and none of them looked at me directly. I could feel the weight of their judgment on me, but I didn't dare look away. The boss stood at the head of the table, his eyes focused on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "You're going to learn today," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Learn how to make decisions. Learn how to handle things the way I do." The men around the table remained silent, their faces unreadable. I wasn't sure if they were waiting for me to speak, or if they were simply observing me, but the tension in the room was thick. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me. "Your first task," the boss continued, "is to choose who will take care of the next problem. We've got a situation, and it's time for you to decide who will handle it." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A situation? Another task? Another life to decide? The men at the table watched me closely, and I could feel their eyes on me like 1,000 needles. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to make decisions that would affect someone's life. But the boss's words hung in the air, a silent command that I couldn't ignore. I looked down at the table, my hands trembling. The file in front of me was empty, blank, with no names or faces to focus on. Nothing to tell me who or what I was about to choose. But I knew what the boss was asking. He was asking me to become part of the machinery, to make the call, to kill. "You'll choose someone," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Choose wisely. Who handles this next problem will define your place here." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I felt like I was suffocating. The weight of what was happening was so much that it was hard to keep my thoughts clear. "Take your time," the boss said, stepping closer. "You don't have to choose now, but you'll have to choose soon." I stared at the empty file, my mind spinning. Who was I supposed to choose? How was I supposed to decide who deserved to die? The minutes ticked by, and the men around the table remained silent, their eyes on me, waiting for me to make my decision. I looked up at the boss, my heart pounding. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The boss looked at me with a mixture of patience and amusement, as if I were a child asking for permission to play. "I want you to learn," he said, his voice cold. "I want you to make the decision. I want you to understand that in this world there is no right or wrong. There is only power." I didn't know how to respond. His words were like poison, seeping into my mind, making everything feel wrong. But I couldn't back down now. I had already crossed the line. I had already taken a life. There was no going back. "Who will it be?" he asked, his voice demanding an answer. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath. I couldn't think. I couldn't process. But I had no choice. I opened my eyes and looked at the men around the table. They were all waiting for me to make my choice. The silence in the room was deafening, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. I reached for the file, though it was still empty, my hands shaking. The decision felt impossible. How was I supposed to choose? "You'll choose," the boss said again, his tone sharp. "You'll decide who lives and who dies. You're ready now." I felt like I was drowning. Every thought, every breath was consumed by the weight of the choice I was about to make. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but there was no escape. Not anymore. The door to the room opened, and one of the men stood up, moving toward me. "Choose," the boss said again. His voice was final. The man who had approached me was standing close now. I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was, but he was one of them. One of the people who existed in this world I had been dragged into. One of the people who would live or die based on my decision. I looked up at him, and for a moment I felt nothing. He was just another face, another person who had walked into this hell I found myself in. But there was a hardness to his gaze, something calculating. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't pleading. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know who to choose." The boss walked toward me, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He didn't touch me, but I felt his presence like a dark cloud hovering over me. "You will choose," he said, his voice cold, devoid of any emotion. "This is your test. This is how you prove you belong here." I couldn't breathe. The world around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing against my chest, making it hard to think, hard to see clearly. "Choose," the boss repeated, "or I will choose for you." The room seemed to tilt, the darkness closing in on me, and for the first time since I had entered this world, I felt the weight of what I had become. A killer. A pawn. Someone who could make the difference between life and death with a single word. I didn't want to choose. I didn't want to make the decision. But there was no escaping it. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached out for the file again, the weight of the choice hanging over me like 1,000 tons of stone. "Choose," the boss commanded once more. And so I did. If you liked the story, drop a comment for part 2, and don't forget to subscribe to Mara's Betrayal.